When we think of civilization, we picture grand cities, brilliant laws, and incredible cultural achievements. It's the story of progress, of humanity rising above its primal instincts. But what if that's only half the story? What if the very foundations of our organized world are built on something much darker? Let's peel back the layers of history and look at what came before the order, before the justice, and before the peace. Long before we talked about human rights, humanity survived on one simple principle: might makes right. Violence wasn't just a random occurrence in our past, it was the engine of change. Early human groups didn't just stumble upon cooperation and decide to build a better world together. They fought for every patch of fertile land, for every hunting ground, and for the simple right to exist. The stronger tribes didn't just outsmart the weaker ones. They conquered them, absorbed them, or wiped them out. Survival of the fittest wasn't a metaphor, it was a brutal, daily reality. This constant, ruthless conflict was the crucible in which the first forms of society were forged. How do you lead a group in a world of endless war? You become the strongest warrior. How do you protect your people? You build a force capable of defending your territory and taking more. The very first leaders were not philosophers or diplomats. They were warlords. Their authority didn't come from a vote. It came from their ability to command respect through strength and fear. Armies, leadership, and borders didn't emerge from peaceful discussions. They were born from the necessity of survival in a violent world. So, the transition from scattered warring tribes to organized kingdoms wasn't a gentle one. It was a process of consolidation through force. The first kings didn't ask for their crowns. They took them through conquest. The first laws weren't designed to protect everyone's freedom. They were created to control populations, to manage resources for the ruling class, and to punish anyone who dared to step out of line. The order we now take for granted was initially imposed by the sword. Civilization didn't eliminate violence. It organized it. It institutionalized it. Think about it. The state claimed a monopoly on violence. Instead of chaotic, individual fighting, you now had state-sanctioned armies and legal punishments. Fear of retribution from a powerful ruler became the new social glue. Justice, in its earliest form, was often just a system of controlled revenge. The stability that allowed art, science, and philosophy to flourish was paid for with bloodshed and domination. It's an uncomfortable thought, but our peaceful cities stand on foundations laid by countless forgotten battles and the subjugation of millions. This isn't to say that cooperation and empathy played no role. Of course they did, but they often existed within the framework created by violence. People cooperated to be stronger in a fight. They showed empathy to those within their own group, their tribe, their kingdom, while viewing outsiders as threats or targets. The US versus them mentality is one of humanity's oldest instincts, and it was sharpened on the whetstone of constant conflict. Understanding this dark origin is crucial. It helps us see that the peace and order we enjoy today are not our natural state. They are a fragile construction built over millennia of struggle. It reminds us that the potential for conflict never truly disappears. It is merely managed. By acknowledging that civilization was born from violence, we can better appreciate the immense effort it takes to maintain a world based on peace, diplomacy, and mutual respect. We didn't just evolve into a peaceful species. We had to build the systems that keep our most dangerous instincts in check. So, the next time you look at the achievements of civilization, remember the hidden price. Remember that beneath the polished veneer of history lies a story of survival, power, and the relentless force that shaped us. The first topic is survival before society. Have you ever wondered what life was like before cities, laws, and even before the idea of a country? Imagine a world with no police to call, no grocery stores to visit, and no doctors to help when you're sick. This was the reality for our earliest ancestors. It was a world of pure, raw survival. Let's journey back in time, tens of thousands of years ago, to understand the brutal, yet essential, role that violence played in forging the very first human societies. Before civilization, the world was a battlefield. Every single day was a struggle for existence. Early humans didn't worry about careers or social media. They worried about finding their next meal and not becoming someone else's. Predators like saber-toothed cats and giant bears roamed the land, and these weren't even the biggest threat. Often, the most dangerous predator was another human. Think about it. You're part of a small, nomadic group, maybe 20 or 30 people. You've just found a rare sort of clean water and a patch of edible plants. This is a jackpot. But then, you see another group approaching. They're just as hungry and desperate as you are. What happens next? There are no negotiations, no treaties, no laws. It comes down to a simple, terrifying calculation. Us or them. In this environment, violence wasn't a moral failing. It was a survival tool. It was as necessary as a sharp rock or the ability to make fire. The groups that were stronger, more aggressive, and better at defending their resources were the ones who lived to see another day. Their children survived, and those traits of aggression and defensiveness were passed down. It's a harsh truth, but evolution doesn't care about our modern feelings. It rewards what works. Within these small bands of early humans, cooperation was key. They hunted together, foraged together, and protected each other from the dangers of the wild. This was the birth of the in-group. Your group was your world, your family, your only source of safety. But here's the flip side. Anyone not in your group was a potential enemy. An outsider was a competitor for scarce food, a threat to your children, a risk to your very existence. The line between us and them was drawn in blood. Morality, as we know it, simply didn't exist. Our modern concepts of right and wrong are a luxury, born from the stability and safety of civilization. For early humans, the only moral compass was survival. Was it wrong to attack another group to take their food if your own family was starving? To them, the only wrong thing to do was to let your own people die. If violence secured food, protected your territory, or eliminated a threat, it wasn't just justified, it was necessary. It was the right thing to do. This constant pressure shaped our ancestors profoundly. Traits like physical strength, a quick temper, and the capacity for ruthless action became valuable assets. The individuals who could dominate others, both inside and outside the group, were often the ones who rose to positions of influence. They weren't elected, they took charge. And this is where the seeds of social structure were planted. As groups grew slightly larger, they needed organization to function. Someone had to make decisions. Who leads the hunt? Where do we camp tonight? How do we deal with a neighboring group that's getting too close? This need for order gave rise to the first leaders. But how did these early leaders establish their authority? Not with inspiring speeches or democratic votes. Authority was built on power, and power was demonstrated through physical prowess and intimidation. The strongest hunter, the most feared warrior, these were the individuals who commanded respect and obedience. Violence, or the credible threat of it, became the foundation of leadership and social hierarchy. Fear was the glue that held these fragile societies together. Fear of the leader's wrath kept internal squabbles in check. It ensured that individuals followed the rules, contributed to the group, and didn't challenge the established order. This internal stability was crucial. A group divided by infighting was an easy target for predators or rival humans. So, the leader's dominance, enforced by fear, was paradoxically what kept everyone safer. Simultaneously, fear of outsiders united the group. The constant threat from other clans created a powerful sense of solidarity. It reinforced the US versus them mentality and justified preemptive attacks or brutal defensive measures. This fear-based system, while terrifying to imagine, was incredibly effective. It provided the structure and discipline necessary for groups to not just survive, but to thrive and grow. Over thousands of years, this dynamic slowly evolved. The most successful leaders weren't just the most brutal. They were also the ones who could maintain a stable group. They learned that some level of fairness, or at least predictability, was necessary to prevent constant challenges to their rule. They distributed food, organized defenses, and mediated disputes. They were the primitive architects of justice, where justice meant order, and order was maintained by the threat of force. This brutal cycle of violence, fear, and the rise of dominant leaders laid the essential groundwork for everything that followed. It created the first hierarchies, the first rules, the first semblance of government. These weren't enlightened societies by any stretch of the imagination, but they were a step up from total chaos. The control and structure born from violence allowed human populations to grow, to become more stable, and to eventually develop more complex cultures. Without this violent crucible, early humans might have remained in scattered, vulnerable bands, forever on the brink of extinction. The very thing we now strive to eliminate from our modern world, violence, was the unlikely catalyst that pushed our ancestors onto the path toward civilization. It's a sobering reminder that the foundations of our peaceful, modern lives are built upon a history that was anything but. The comfort and security we enjoy today were earned through millennia of brutal, violent struggle. The second topic is power through force. Have you ever wondered why our world is structured the way it is, with governments, laws, and borders? It might surprise you to learn that the answer, deep down, is rooted in violence. Not the chaotic, random violence of early survival, but something far more organized and deliberate. This is the story of how force became power, and how that transformation built the world we know today. In the earliest days of humanity, violence was mostly about survival. It was a raw, instinctual tool used to hunt for food, fend off predators, and compete for scarce resources. Your personal strength, your ability to fight, was your primary asset. But as human groups began to grow from small family bands into larger tribes and communities, something fundamental shifted. The nature of violence began to evolve. Suddenly, strength alone wasn't enough to secure your place. With more people came more complexity. Now, the real power wasn't just in controlling a piece of land or a water source, but in controlling other people. The ability to influence, direct, and command others became the new currency of authority. This was a monumental change. Those individuals who could master not just the act of fighting, but the organization of it, began to rise. This is where we see the birth of leadership as we understand it. Leaders emerged who weren't just the strongest fighters, but the best strategists and organizers. They understood that a coordinated group was far more powerful than any single individual. They began to form specialized groups, the first warriors, guards, and Their job was clear: enforce the leader's decisions, defend the group's territory against outsiders, and perhaps most importantly, crush any challenges to authority from within. Power was no longer a personal attribute. It became an organized system. This was a critical turning point in human history. The concept of territory itself was transformed. It was no longer just a place to live and find food. It became a symbol of power, a declaration of dominance. Groups fought not just to survive, but to expand their influence, to subjugate other peoples, and to claim ownership of the land. In this new reality, victory in battle meant more than just survival. It meant expansion, tribute, and the growth of your group's influence. Defeat, on the other hand, was catastrophic. It could mean being wiped out, absorbed into the victorious group, or forced into a state of submission, paying tribute and serving new masters. It was through this relentless cycle of conflict that the first borders were drawn, often in blood. And these borders did more than just define territory. They began to forge identities. You were defined by the group you belonged to, the leader you served, and the land you defended. As rulers consolidated their power, they made a crucial discovery: the threat of violence could be even more effective than the constant use of it. Fear became a primary tool of governance. Why waste resources and risk your best warriors putting down a rebellion if you can prevent it from ever happening in the first place? Public displays of force, parades of warriors, swift and brutal punishments for dissenters served as a constant, chilly reminder of who was in charge. Obedience became the safest path for the average person. It was simply more logical to comply than to risk defiance and face the consequences. This concentration of power, enforced by organized violence, inevitably led to the growth of social inequality. A clear hierarchy began to form. At the very top were the rulers and their elite warriors, living lives of privilege, protection, and plenty. Below them, the vast majority of the population toiled. They were the farmers, the laborers, and the foot soldiers who worked, fought, and often suffered under the rule of the powerful. Violence was the glue that held this structure together. It enforced this stark imbalance, maintained the social hierarchy, and ensured the loyalty, or at least the compliance of the mass. It's a common misconception to think that civilization arose from a desire for peace. In reality, this new era of power through force didn't end violence at all. Instead, it refined it. It transformed violence from unpredictable chaos into a systematic, predictable tool of the state. This system, for all its brutality, had an unexpected outcome. It allowed for stability on a scale never seen before. It made it possible for huge populations, numbering in the thousands and eventually millions, to live together under a single authority. This controlled aggression became the foundation upon which larger societies were built. It was the framework that allowed for the creation of cities, the administration of empires, and the development of what we call civilization. Force became the basis for law, and law became the backbone of the state. The rules that governed society were not born from a philosophical debate about justice. They were born from the practical need of a ruler to maintain control. So, when we look back at the grand sweep of human history, at the rise of empires and the building of monuments, we must recognize the uncomfortable truth at their core. Our journey from small, scattered tribes to sprawling, complex civilizations was not a peaceful one. It was a path paved by the strategic and systematic application of force. The transformation of violence from a mere survival instinct into an instrument of governance is perhaps one of the most significant and most unsettling developments in our entire history. It's a legacy that continues to shape our world in countless ways, a shadow that stretches from the ancient past right into our present day. The third topic is war, control, and order. Have you ever wondered how our ancient ancestors went from small, scattered tribes to building massive civilizations? The answer, surprisingly, is tied to the evolution of violence itself. Let's journey back in time. As human populations grew, so did the scale of conflict. What started as small-scale skirmishes between rival groups slowly transformed into something much bigger and more organized: war. But this wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. War became a powerful tool, a method for imposing order on a chaotic world. Think about it. To wage a successful war, you need more than just brave fighters. You need a plan. You need discipline. You need a clear chain of command. This necessity gave birth to the first armies, with generals, officers, and soldiers, all working together toward a common goal. Suddenly, violence wasn't random anymore. It became predictable. It followed rules, it had objectives, and it was waged with strategy. This new, organized form of conflict completely reshaped human society. When one group conquered another, they didn't just win a fight. They gained territory, resources, and control over people. The defeated were either absorbed into the new, larger group, forced to move elsewhere, or made to submit to the victor's rule. This was the very beginning of early states and kingdoms. For the first time, clear borders were drawn on the map, defining who was us and who was them. Your identity became tied to the land you lived on, and loyalty to your leader and your kingdom became paramount. This process also created a powerful new kind of leader. To command an army and lead a kingdom, you needed centralized authority. Warlords and kings justified their immense power by offering a simple but compelling deal to their people. Protection: they promised to keep their subjects safe from outside enemies, both real and imagined. In return, the people gave up some of their individual freedom and accepted the leader's control. This was the birth of a fundamental social contract. You give me your obedience, and I'll give you security. This basic trade-off became the bedrock of governance for thousands of years. It's a dynamic we can still see playing out in politics all around the world today. The influence of this new military-style organization didn't stop at the battlefield. It seeped into every aspect of civilian life. Think about the incredible infrastructure projects of the ancient world. The Roman roads, for example, were initially built to move legions quickly across the empire. Cities were designed with massive walls and strategic layouts for defense. The entire economy, from farming to craftsmanship, was often geared towards supplying and sustaining the army. The discipline and hierarchy of the military became a model for how to organize society as a whole. Systems of taxation, labor, and administration all began to mirror the structured command of an army. In a very real sense, the first states were run like military operations. Now, this might sound grim, but there's a fascinating paradox here. While war is inherently violent, the state's monopoly on it actually made daily life safer for the average person. By legitimizing its own violence, the ability to wage war, punish criminals, and enforce laws, the state actively suppressed private, unsanctioned violence. Feuds between families, banditry, and random attacks were cracked down on. This meant that while your personal freedom might have been limited, your chances of surviving day-to-day life actually increased. The world became more stable, more predictable. So, civilization didn't arise by eliminating violence. Instead, it harnessed it. It took the chaotic, destructive force of human conflict and channeled it into a tool for building order, creating structure, and expanding societies. War forced humans to organize on a massive scale, to cooperate in unprecedented ways, and to submit to a central authority for the promise of collective security. It was through this brutal, bloody process of control that scattered tribes were forged into the great civilizations that laid the foundation for the world we live in today. It's a dark but crucial part of our shared human story. The fourth topic is laws born from fear. Have you ever wondered where laws really come from? We like to think they're about justice, fairness, and creating a good society. But what if I told you the true origin of law is much darker? What if the very foundation of our civilization was built not on high-minded ideals, but on raw, primal fear? Let's travel back in time, to an era when societies were just beginning to form. As villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, a new problem emerged. How do you control thousands, even millions, of people? The old ways of using brute force and violence just weren't cutting it anymore. Keeping a constant watch over everyone, punishing every single transgression with a sword or a club, was incredibly expensive and exhausting. More importantly, it was unstable. A population ruled only by violence is a population ready to rebel at any moment. Leaders, kings, and emperors needed a better system, a more efficient tool to maintain their power. And so, they created laws. But these first laws weren't about what was right or wrong in a moral sense. They were a tool of control, born from the fear of losing that control. Early legal codes were essentially a list of don'ts, with a very clear message: step out of line, and the consequences will be severe. The goal wasn't to create a just society, it was to create an obedient one. The fear of brutal punishment was meant to replace the constant need for a soldier on every corner. People started following the rules, not because they suddenly believed in a shared sense of justice, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. Think about it, in these early legal systems, what do you think were the most serious crimes? It wasn't theft from a neighbor or a simple assault. The harshest penalties were reserved for crimes against the state, against the ruler, against the guys the ruler claimed to represent. Treason, disrespect to authority, or failing to pay taxes were met with punishments designed to be as public and horrifying as possible. The message was crystal clear. The law protects the powerful first. For everyone else, the law was a set of instructions. Obey, work, pay your dues, and stay in your place. The idea of equality before the law was a fantasy. In fact, law was specifically designed to reinforce the existing hierarchy, not challenge it. This is where the psychology of fear really comes into play. Rulers understood something profound about human nature. Fear is a much more efficient tool for control than direct violence. You can only beat so many people, but you can scare millions. Public punishments were a form of psychological theater. When someone was flogged, branded, or executed in the town square, it wasn't just about punishing that one individual. It was a spectacle for everyone else. It was a lesson, a terrifying demonstration of the state's power. Each person watching would think, that could be me. That thought, that fear, was enough to ensure their compliance for weeks, months, even years. Fear spread through the community like a virus, doing the work of 1,000 guards. People began to police themselves, regulating their own behavior to avoid even the slightest chance of facing that same fate. The control became internalized. To make this system of fear even more powerful, leaders brilliantly wove it together with religion and tradition. They didn't just say, "This is my law." They said, "This is the law of the gods." By claiming divine approval for their rules, they elevated them beyond simple human commands. Disobeying the law wasn't just a crime against the king. It was a sin against the heavens. This was a master's. It made resistance not just dangerous, but immoral. It made obedience a sacred duty. The fear was no longer just physical, the fear of the executioner's axe. It became spiritual, the fear of eternal damnation. How could you argue with a law that was handed down from the gods themselves? This divine authority dramatically reduced dissent and made the population much easier to manage. Now, it's easy for us to look back and judge this system as barbaric and unjust. And in many ways, it was. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. This system, built on a foundation of fear, created a new kind of stability. With a clear set of rules, even unfair ones, came predictability. Merchants could travel long distances, knowing that there were laws against robbery, and that those laws would be brutally enforced. Farmers could plant their crops with a reasonable expectation that they wouldn't be randomly plundered by a passing warlord. Cities could grow, trade networks could flourish, and culture could develop in ways that were impossible in a world of constant, chaotic violence. People could plan for the future. This predictability, born from fear-based order, was the fertile ground in which civilization as we know it began to grow. The structure provided, however harsh, allowed for complexity and progress. Of course, the story of law doesn't end there. Over centuries, and through countless revolutions, philosophical debates, and social movements, our legal systems began to change. New ideas, radical ideas at the time started to creep in. Concepts like individual rights, human dignity, morality, and fairness slowly began to challenge the old order. We started to believe that laws should serve the people, not just the powerful. We started to demand that justice should be blind and that everyone should be equal in the eyes of the law. This was a long, bloody, and difficult struggle, and it's a struggle that continues to this day. But we must never forget the roots. The DNA of our legal systems still carries the code of their origin. The instinct to use law as a tool of control, to prioritize order over justice, and to rely on fear to ensure compliance, has never truly disappeared. We see echoes of it even today, in debates about surveillance, policing, and the power of the state. So, the next time you think about the law, remember its dual nature. It is a tool for justice, a protector of rights, and a framework for a fair society. But it was born from something much older and much darker. It was born from the fear of chaos, the desire for power, and the use of terror as a tool of social engineering. Law tamed violence by replacing it with the fear of violence. It was this transformation from raw force to structured fear that created the order necessary for civilization to rise. The foundation of our world wasn't built on a gentle handshake, but on an iron fist, and understanding that history is crucial to shape in a more just future. The fifth topic is the dark foundation of civilization. We often look back at the rise of civilization with a sense of awe. We see magnificent cities reaching for the sky, libraries brimming with knowledge, and art that captures the human spirit. It's a story of progress, of humanity's greatest achievement. But what if I told you there's a darker story hidden beneath the surface, a foundation that we rarely talk about? What if the very systems that brought us order, stability, and progress were built on something we now try so hard to avoid? Violence. Let's travel back in time. Before the first cities, before the first laws, life was chaotic, unpredictable, and often brutal. Small tribes and scattered groups fought constantly for resources, for survival. There was no order, only the law of the strongest. Now, imagine the birth of the first civilizations. How did humanity tame this chaos? The common narrative is that we came together, we cooperated, we built things, and that's true, but it's only half the story. The other half is that we learned to control violence. Think about it. As societies grew, violenza dinte Hispanis, it transformed. Instead of a free-for-all, where anyone could inflict harm, violence became a tool. It was centralized, monopolized, and wielded by a new kind of power. The state, suddenly, only rulers, their armies, and their institutions were allowed to use force. This was a radical shift. It meant that the random, everyday violence between individuals decreased. But a new, organized form of violence took its place. Order arrived, but it came at the cost of freedom. People were no longer just fighting each other. They were now subject to the authority of a king, an emperor, or a government that held the ultimate power. This new structure, this dark foundation, is what allowed large-scale societies to function. How were the Great Pyramids built? How were the Roman roads laid across an entire continent? Often, through forced labor, with the threat of punishment looming over anyone who resisted. How were borders defended and empires expanded? Through armies whose entire purpose was organized, state-sanctioned violence. And how were laws enforced? Through punishment, fines, imprisonment, or even death. People followed the rules, not always because they agreed with them, but because they feared the consequences of breaking them. Stability was achieved through submission. It's a chilling thought, but this system worked. By containing and controlling violence, civilization created a space where other things could grow, where the threat of constant raids and warfare reduced. People could focus on more than just day-to-day survival. Trade routes could be established and protected. Farmers could cultivate their land with a degree of certainty that their crops wouldn't be stolen. In this bubble of state-enforced order, knowledge could be accumulated and passed down. Education emerged. Culture flourished. Philosophers could debate the meaning of life, and artists could create timeless masterpieces. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The fear of controlled violence created the conditions for human creativity and intellectual growth to soar. The background noise of chaos was silenced, allowing for progress. But this foundation left deep and lasting scars on humanity. The very structure that created order also embedded inequality and oppression into the fabric of society. Those who held the monopoly on violence, the rulers. The elites naturally shaped the rules to benefit themselves. They created hierarchies, where some were born to rule and others were born to serve. This system justified exploitation. The suffering of the many was often seen as a necessary price for the stability and prosperity of the few. The farmer toiling in the field, the laborer building a monument, the soldier dying in a foreign land, their lives were secondary to the grand project of civilization. Violence, or the threat of it, became the tool that maintained this unequal balance. It normalized the idea that some people were inherently more valuable than others. For centuries, this was simply the way of the world. But slowly, things began to change. People started to question this system. Whispers of new ideas of rights, of justice, of equality began to spread. Philosophers and revolutionaries started to argue that power should just belong to the strongest or the most ruthless. They argued that every individual has inherent worth and that no one should be subjected to arbitrary force. These weren't just abstract debates. They led to real-world upheavals. Revolutions were fought not just to overthrow one ruler for another, but to challenge the very nature of power itself. The goal was to limit the state's ability to use violence against its own people. This was a long, bloody, and difficult struggle, and it's a struggle that is far from over. We've made incredible progress. We've developed concepts like human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, all designed to put checks on power and protect individuals from the state. We've tried to redefine violence, to contain it within a framework of justice. Yet, even in our modern world, we can still see the echoes of this dark foundation. Think about it. Our laws are still ultimately backed by the threat of force. Police carry weapons, and our borders are guarded by armies. The state still holds the monopoly on legitimate violence. The difference, ideally, is that this power is now meant to be accountable to the people, not just to a single ruler. But the fundamental principle remains. So why is it so important to understand this uncomfortable history? It's not about being cynical or glorifying violence. It's about being realistic. It's about recognizing that the peaceful, orderly world many of us enjoy today wasn't simply born from good intentions. It was forged in a crucible of conflict and control. It emerged from humanity's desperate and often brutal struggle to tame its own worst instincts. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish the incredible achievements of civilization. In fact, it makes them even more remarkable. It shows us how far we've come. The uncomfortable truth is that the roots of our world run deep into dark soil. The peace we cherish is fragile, and the systems that uphold it are more complex than we like to admit. To build a better, more just, and more peaceful future, we can't ignore the past. We have to confront it. We have to understand the violent machinery that built our world so we can continue the work of dismantling its worst parts and build something better in its place. Because the story of civilization isn't over. We are still writing it every single day. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, consider subscribing and joining the conversation below. See you next time.